And then finally, avoiding a zero-sum or black and white view on Thailand and China. The Thais want us to be more subtle and more nuanced in our approach. I think we all need to be. Thank you. Terrific.
Thank you very much, John. Let's turn to Richard.
All right, good morning, or it's good noon. Thank you very much for arranging this, Amy, and the CSIS family. I'm glad that I'm joined by John or Juan. I think, after all, before there was a Trump, there was a Duterte, but before there was a Duterte, there was a Prayut, right? So I think it's good that we combined these interesting characters today and look forward to the question and answer portion. Well, as Amy suggested, this talk is part of a broader set of book tour I've been doing on my latest book, Rise of Duterte, which is essentially my dissertation to be a licensed Dutertologist, or that's the way my friends put it. So I'm going to discuss about Philippine-U.S. alliance under Duterte. I'm going to be quick about this. I'm going to skim through some of the slides so that we have more time for question and answer. That picture is actually interesting. If I'm not mistaken, that was the first time that the Chinese made a visit to Davao, and he took the call from Donald Trump, the invite to come to the White House there. And essentially, Duterte said, I'm too busy. I might not make it to the United States. And I felt that was a very interesting picture that says a lot about the direction of where the Philippines is going. Now, just to be provocative, but actually also there's a substantive basis for it, I classify actually Duterte as Gorbachev. And I base that on analysis of Alexander Wendt, of how Mikhail Gorbachev made a significant change in Soviet Union's foreign policy in the 1990s. And he said that for that significant change to happen, there have to be two conditions to be fulfilled. First is presence of new social situations that cannot be managed in terms of pre-existing ones, meaning there are new security challenges that have to be dealt with, new approaches. And the second thing is that a change in your strategic calculus should not have more cost and benefit. So there's a cost-benefit analysis that has to be put there. And I think that's very relevant in terms of how Duterte has been reshaping Philippine foreign policy. Now, Duterte always talks about separation, among other things, but what's happening in the Philippines is really strategic recalibration. The revolution that he introduced in Philippine-U.S. relationship is nonetheless clear. Our relationship with America is no longer special and sacred. It's essentially transactional. And I know that that word is sounding familiar, so just a warning, a lot of things I'm going to say about Duterte is going to sound very familiar here in Washington, D.C. For me, there are 5 drivers of the strategic recalibration under Duterte, or you would say this revolution of changing a sacred relationship into a transactional one. The first thing you have to keep in mind is that Duterte, again, this is going to sound familiar, he turned the last elections into essentially a referendum on the existing political regime in the Philippines and its foreign policy. So when he ran, he didn't say, I'm against their economic and domestic political policy. I'm not against the oligarchs. I'm also against oligarchs who are subservient to America. So if you really want to have a patriotic leader, you're going to elect me and put it there. Some of his speeches, in a very vivacious manner, where actually he clad himself in the Philippine flag, he would kiss the flag and make these kind of statements. So this is something that a lot of people are missing. Drug was a big part of his policy agenda, but it was fundamental rejection of everything that the Philippine liberal oligarchy has stood for in the past 3 decades since the fall of the Marcos regime. The second factor you have to keep in mind is what gave Duterte a lot of confidence to essentially cuss and swear at the American ambassador, at Obama, among other things, is that he was able to consolidate power very rapidly. So Duterte comes from a party called PDP Laban, which had 3 members elected into the parliament or the Philippine Congress. Within 2 months, they have 300 members. And the opposition, the Liberal Party, signed a non-aggression pact. An analog to that would be, let's say, Trump wins on the ticket of Tea Party, and the entire Democratic and Republican Party defects to them with Bernie Sanders and few other people in the opposition. That's essentially what happened in the Philippines, and he will be appointing 12 out of 16 members of the Philippine Supreme Court, which means essentially the legislative and the judiciary branches of the Philippines right now are more or less under the influence of the executive branch. And that gave him a significant amount of confidence. Now, we saw similar trend, although in a more glacial manner in the case of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, in the case of Turkey, and in the case of Putin. So in my book, I actually compared Duterte to the case of Putin and Erdogan, with the exception that in the case of Putin, Putin was a KGB. He was a member of the security establishment, while Erdogan needed a decade to really reshape the Turkish foreign policy by increasingly strengthening his grip on the defense establishment. The third factor is, all due respect to friends from the Obama administration, I'm consistent on this. I'm not saying this to impress Duterte. Before there was a Duterte, I was already criticizing Obama administration. I felt there was a lack of commitment on the part of Obama administration. I'm very, very sensitive when American officials say, we don't go to war over a bunch of rocks. And in the Filipino imagination, Scarborough Shoal is not a bunch of rocks. It's an extension of our national territory. And as our Defense Secretary, Mr. Lorenzana, said, and a Chinese reclamation and militarization on the Scarborough Shoal is too close for us to tolerate. So I think there's a gap between the language. I would say Senkaku are really a bunch of rocks, and yet they're clearly put under the Mutual Defense Treaty with Japan. 3 days later, Obama comes to the Philippines and say, we don't go to war over a bunch of rocks. And it kind of worries me when officials up until today are using those kinds of what I would call dismissive words. And these dismissive words were exactly what gave Duterte the ammunition to come in and say, America is not reliable. They don't have our back, which is the contrast with China. I mean, just to give you an idea, when the arbitration award came out in July 12, ASEAN as an organization was quiet. It took 3 days for the European Union to come up with a very soft statement. But as far as the U.S. is concerned, President Obama sent Susan Rice to Beijing as if Beijing was the party that was aggrieved, not the Philippines. So there was a lot of problem here. And when John Kerry said we have to be patient and calm, I felt that was not the language we wanted to hear. The language I wanted to hear was what came from Tokyo and Canberra, which is the arbitration award is final and binding. It's time for compliance. Those were the words I was hoping to hear more forcefully from the American administration. And this is what gave Duterte this ammunition to say U.S. is not reliable. In contrast, the Chinese were very clear. In the Philippines, the joke is that the Chinese ambassador in the Philippines is called the whisperer because he's always whispering something to the president. He meets the president more than any other foreign envoy and diplomat. And I think the Chinese ambassador did a very good job of saying, if you try to, use this arbitration award to embarrass us, if you welcome more American military presence in the Philippines, in the South China Sea, we're going to make life hell for you. And in fact, they deployed nuclear-capable bombers close to the Scarborough Shoal. They conducted joint military exercises with Russia. They did all the kind of signaling. But at the same time said, if you play nice and not raise the award and kind of downgrade some aspects of your relationship with U.S., which was like a dagger pointing at us, we'll make life quite heaven for you and offer you all the economic incentives that your ASEAN buddies like Malaysia and Vietnam have been getting. So the contrast between ambivalence of the Obama administration and the clear deal that China was offering kind of made it rational or provided the room for Duterte to rationalize this kind of a soft peddling on the arbitration award and increasing downgrading of our cooperation with the U.S. in the South China Sea. But the fifth factor, again, this is going to sound familiar. I've never seen any president, probably before Trump, who has used the word I, me, myself, my emotions, my feelings about the United States, which kind of reminds me of l'état c'est moi, of, I am the state. I mean, it was fascinating. So Duterte goes to China and he says, I am separating from U.S. I will join with Russia and China against the world. He's quite poetic, actually, sometimes, and rhythmic in his prose. And then the next day he comes back and says, no, that is my emotions, not necessarily the policy of the state. So he has this kind of interesting, plausible deniability going on there. But nonetheless, if you look at the case of Russia, if you case of Turkey, in countries when you have growing authoritarianization and personalization of foreign policy, you see more unpredictability. And we have seen that also in the case of the Philippines. But where is the Filipino public standing on this issue? Thankfully, I didn't have, unfortunately, I didn't have the budget, but thankfully there was someone else who did the public opinion for me. Now, no surprise. If you look at the survey asking who's the most favored nation, U.S. on top, almost statistically tied with Japan. So we forgot about the nasty things Japan did during the Second World War. Not my grandma. But China and Russia are in the bottom. In fact, China went lower earlier this year, despite all of the good things that Duterte said, including China, thank you for loving us. Where things get interesting, of course, the other question was, do people care about foreign policy, particularly the South China Sea issue? Only 6% said it's a top 3 priority. That's where the survey becomes interesting. But it becomes even more interesting later on. People were asked, should we raise the arbitration award? Yes, many say we should raise it. But people were asked, should we develop or explore security and defense cooperation with China and Russia than the United States? A large plurality were actually on board with that, 47. And then when they were asked, do you think U.S. has been helpful, half of Filipinos were undecided or kind of said no. Which means Filipinos love America, but there's a credibility, reliability gap, which has been very skillfully and deftly used by Duterte to say, we need recalibration. I know you love America and all of that. Maybe we cannot trust China that much, but we have to be practical about this. And that kind of logic is trickling down to a point that I had taxi drivers lecturing me about this. Right? Oh, I notice you. You're the analyst guy, right? But let's be practical about this. So this is an interesting to keep in mind. But where is our relationship with the United States? Well, if you look at the actual impact of Duterte's strategic recalibration, the reality is that Duterte is powerful compared to his predecessors, but he's not a king. He does not have a unilateral power over key issues of decision-making, including our relationship with America. So the Philippine security establishment, the military, influential members of the foreign ministry, among others, have done a pretty good job of making sure that the foundation of our relationship with America has remained intact. So from around 61, 62 military exercises, 57 are still there, right? And if anything, the Daesh or ISIS has served actually as a glue. As some Pentagon officials told me, our counterterrorism cooperation has never been better. If anything, it has got even stronger. And one interesting episode was when the Philippine Defense Ministry asked for American Special Forces to go to Marawi and provide training, apparently without the president's approval. And the next day, the president half sarcastically says, well, they love America, what can I do, right? And and just to keep things in mind, the Philippines today, in my opinion, has the most militarized, democratically elected government on earth. Duterte has more generals in his cabinet than Donald Trump could ever dream. 7 members of his cabinet and sub-cabinet are either current or previous heads of the Joint Chief of Staff. So he very much is deferential to the military, who has nixed all other important decisions, including negotiations and concessions to the communists. This is something that is missed in the discussion about the Philippines, the influence of the security establishment in shaping and taming Duterte's foreign policy. The other thing is Duterte has adopted a bifurcated approach towards the United States. So when he swears and cusses at America, he's essentially talking about the Democratic Party, some feisty Republicans, and the U.S. media. Those are the people he's cussing at. But when it comes to the U.S. executive branch, Duterte has consistently sung praise for Trump and the First Lady, among other things, right? So he has a much more bifurcated approach. So he tries to keep strong with the Trump administration, while at the same time projecting strength and independence when it comes to criticism from the congressional or other quarters of American government. Nonetheless, while the foundation of our relationship has been intact, the reality is that Duterte's recalibration has provided China a carte blanche in the South China Sea. And that's something that has been worrying, in my opinion, and that has been one of areas of my disagreement openly with the administration. Well, he has actively blocked criticism of China's activities in the South China Sea as ASEAN chairman. So I actually feel bad for Laos, because today it's Philippines and Cambodia essentially going for the gold medal of loyalty to China. So if you look at the statement of Cambodia in 2012 and Philippines in 2017, and compare that to Laos last year, Laos' loyalty is a little bit questionable right now to China. So we, in fact, had a situation whereby we're fighting against former emerging allies like Vietnam on this issue. There were very heated discussions between our foreign minister in Vietnam. In fact, our foreign minister on some occasions actually implicitly said Vietnam is actually the troublesome country because, by the way, Vietnam controls the most number of land features, and they also did some little reclamation here and there after all. So you have these interesting internal fights going on between Philippines and Vietnam. And the other thing is that Duterte has not mentioned the Philippine Arbitration Award in any multilateral fora. So when I go to the European Union or I talk to the other allies, they can say we cannot be holier than the Pope or holier than Duterte or whatever. So their point is, if you don't want to raise this, we cannot raise this on your behalf. But my argument is that you have to keep on raising this because this is not about the Philippines. This is about international law and international order, right? And if anything, I think the Philippines' decision to push for an arbitration award is a classic case of constructive unilateralism. Everyone talks about consensus and unanimity in ASEAN, which sometimes creates some paralysis. When the Philippines filed the arbitration award, most of ASEAN was not on board. But because of that arbitration award, Malaysia, Indonesia, other countries have an ammunition against China that they could use against China. So we contributed to other ASEAN countries' claims against China by nullifying the 9-dash line. So in that sense, I think it's something that we have to look at. The other thing is, Philippines and China right now are in the midst of discussion of a joint development agreement. There is one discussion, this is not a joint development yet, but there's a discussion of a CNOOC and Philippine National Oil company doing some sort of a project whereby, but this is more like private sector kind of Shell Philippines kind of arrangement. But down the road, there could be discussions of joint development. In principle, I have no problem with joint development. I think it's one way to move forward. International law sanctions that. My problem is joint development in certain areas could actually affirm and legitimize China's 9-dash line, which is clearly against the spirit of international law. So the devil is in the details. In principle, I'm for joint development, but I want to see where exactly you're going to have the joint development. But any discussion of joint development is now giving China an ammunition to say other countries are de facto recognizing my expansive territorial claim. The other thing that is worrying me is that China has been emboldened by the soft pedaling of the Philippines. So we had this grand celebration earlier this year. Finally, we agreed on an outline of a framework of a possible legally binding code of conduct. Right? After 15 years of discussion since the DOC and almost 25 years of the idea of COC coming forward. Like, congratulations. The problem is, not only is the Philippines saying, maybe we don't need legally binding anymore, China is saying that even if you don't want a legally binding, by the way, we have a precondition. And one of the preconditions is that there should not be any major outside interference for us to have a non-legally binding code of conduct, which in my opinion is nothing but a repackaged DOC, which provides this mirage that China is diplomatic and nice, but on the ground the facts are changing every day. So my problem here is that what does China mean, no major outside interference? Are they telling us to drop our relationship with the US? Are they telling us to criticize freedom of navigation operations by America? Right? This is the problem we have. Every time we go soft, China asks for more. We go hard. China explains that maybe you're making it too fast. So my fear is this whole COC is just a strategy by China to project diplomatic niceties, but a cover essentially for what's it doing on the ground. That's why my proposal is a COC legally binding among claimant states in ASEAN per se, but we have no time to discuss that. Now, nonetheless, is Duterte's recalibration towards China, I'm wrapping up, something that is unidirectional, linear, and set in stone? Absolutely not. It's reversible. As some Chinese friend told me, like, sometimes Duterte is too good to be true. Is he going to be nice to us forever? And I said, you never know. The first thing is, there's a whole discussion about, oh, China is going to turn the Philippines into another Cambodia. I mean, a place like Cambodia, probably what? I saw a data says that 1/4 or 1/3 of the national budget comes from China. That's never going to happen in a country like the Philippines with a $400 billion GDP and 100 million population. That's not going to happen. China's offered a lot of infrastructure investment, but I'm going to believe it when I see it, right? Because if you look at studies by Rand Corporation, among others, someone who has studied China's investments in the Middle East, sometimes the ratio is 10 to 1. For every 20 billion they offer you, they bring in 2 billion sometimes. When in fact in the Philippines, we have a Dutertenomics agenda of build, build, build. Only a small portion of that will come from overseas development assistance. And if anything, actually, if you look at all major projects in the Philippines, Japan is on the forefront, including the underground metro plan in Metro Manila. My concern is, ironically, a communist country is doing a better PR job in terms of selling its incentives that sometimes don't come in than countries like Japan and China who have significant investment already in the Philippines. And Japan is actually coming in stronger. So in short, I'm not fearing about a debt trap with China, to be honest. I don't see that. My bigger concern is corruption. Right? You don't need to buy the whole country. You just have to influence the right people. And that's one thing I have to keep in mind. The other thing I have to keep in mind is China is doing some fishy activities close to the Philippine land features. So you had a very interesting situation whereby the Philippine military gave the data to a member of the opposition to essentially tell the government to take a tougher stance. This is where there was suspicious Chinese activity close to the Woody Island, which is just next few nautical miles away from the Philippines, Tito Island. In fact, very interesting thing happened here. The Philippine military, I don't know if this is violation of protocol, came out with a statement and said, we essentially call upon the foreign ministry to raise this issue with China. Because our foreign ministry was going the extra mile to say, nothing is happening there, it's freedom of navigation. Last time I checked, within 2-3 nautical miles of your territorial waters, that's not freedom of navigation. But anyways, maybe they don't know about UNCLOS. And the other thing is, you know, all of these things are going on, but what's worrying me is really in Scarborough Shoal. In my opinion, any Chinese movement on the Scarborough Shoal, which is increasingly likely with Xi Jinping consolidating power already, and we know that Xi Jinping is overseeing personally the reclamation activities, I think that's going to be a big game changer. Whether Duterte wants it or not, if some of these things happen, that could have a significant impact in terms of direction of Philippine foreign policy. True that 6% of Filipinos said foreign policy is a priority, but when something major happened, like when there was a news that China was doing something in the Benham Rise, you immediately had public backlash. And the Philippine media, in my opinion, which is a little bit anti-China too much, is very good in sensationalizing that. So in my opinion, nothing is set in stone. So to friends in certain capitals, don't be overconfident. To other capitals, don't be over-panic. Things could change, probably for better or worse. I'll keep it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Admiral Montgomery.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to talk after Richard and John, both really entertaining presentations. And I knew when I was following an academic and a writer, I wasn't going to get the 15 minutes. So I'm going to compress this down a little bit so we can get to some questions. As Amy mentioned, my comments are informed by the last